Next, CityNet 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
On Friday, October the 22nd, we will have Commissioner Jim Francisconi to the podium. The Commissioner will speak on his youth agenda for Portland. Once again, we'll be here at the Hilton Hotel in the Pavilion Room. This year's annual fund is well underway, but our goal for this millennium is $100,000. Please help us reach the goal by making your contribution today if you can. On Wednesday, October the 20th, the Public Services and Safety Issue Committee will be meeting, featuring co-chairs of the 1997 House Prison Workforce Committee on the topic, Educating Prisoners, a Plan to Reduce Recidivism. It'll be at noon in the club office. Our board host today, seated at the head table, is panel member Kurt Krause. He's co-chair of our Business and Technology Issue Committee. He will ask the first question of our speaker. Following Kurt's questions, we'll open up questions from the floor. Now, it's our expectation next week that in addition to questions from the floor, we'll have cards at each table so that you members that are too shy to come up to the microphone will have an opportunity to do so by asking questions, written questions, and then bring them up to the podium. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part because of corporate underwriting from Providence Health Plans, from U.S. Bank, and from Washington Mutual Savings Bank. We're very grateful for their support. Rapidly expanding technology is putting new demands on our system, raising ethical and constitutional questions we never dreamed of even a generation or two ago. Our forefathers could never have predicted the complications of today at the time of ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791. Their most rapid communication was a horse or a smoke signal. As kind of a sidebar, I wonder what kind of Bill of Rights we would have had if the founders had had websites and email for input. I remember as a child the stringing of telephone lines in the farming community where I lived, and marveled at the ease with which we were able to communicate. But the lines had 2, 4, and 10-party lines that opened up the information age for the neighbors listening in as well. Another generation or two will see a geometric increase in the technology from what we have today. How do we cope with the protection of ourselves, our privacy, and at the same time maintaining the broader rights of society? A transparent society has its limits. Charlie Hinkle comes to us with a broad experience in this field. For over 25 years, he's been teaching, writing, speaking, and litigating about free speech, privacy, and other constitutional issues. Charlie's a graduate of Stanford, of Union Theological Seminary, and Yale Law School. He's a partner in the law firm of Stoel, Rives, and an ordained minister of the United Church of Christ, and an adjunct professor of law at the Northwestern School of Law at Lewis and Clark. He served, as I mentioned, as president of City Club, and has been the American Civil Liberties Union president for Oregon, and as well as served on the ACLU's national board. He will speak about some First Amendment fundamentals and how they relate to free speech and privacy concerns in the internet. Charlie?
Thank you, Lloyd. I appreciate the invitation to speak to the City Club again, especially on a topic that is so close to my field of interest, so dear to my heart in a way. So far as I know, there was no calculation in the timing of this particular speech for today, but there is a happy coincidence in the timing because, as many of you know from reading the newspapers the last few weeks, it is next week that marks the 30th anniversary of the birth of the Internet. It was on October 20th, 1969, that a computer scientist at UCLA typed the letter L on his computer keyboard, and it appeared on the monitor of a computer at the Stanford Research Institute in Palo Alto. Two computers talked to each other that day for the first time in history, and a revolution was born. Now, as sometimes happens with revolutions, this one grew slowly at first. As late as 1980, there were still fewer than 300 computers that were linked together in this new network. Nearly all of them were in government agencies and in research universities. Today, there are over 50 million host computers online, connecting 159 countries and over 200 million users. Just 3 years ago, only about 14% of the population of the United States used the internet. Today, the figure is over 40%. The volume of traffic on the internet, it is said, doubles about every 3 months. Tens of thousands of people are online at any given moment, buying books or making airline reservations, reading the letters of Tolstoy or the lyrics from Evita, finding out the temperature in Tokyo or the population of Bombay, or simply chatting with each other. The amount of information at our fingertips is staggering, and it is especially staggering when you view it in historic context. If it is true, as we've been told, that the New York Times, in a single daily edition, contains more information than a person was likely to learn in a lifetime in 17th century England, think of the almost infinitely greater amount of information that is now available to us, to anyone who uses the internet, at least, at the click of a mouse. Now, whenever there is access to information, there inevitably emerges from one source or another an urge to restrict the availability of that information. The desire to prevent someone else from reading something that you don't like seems to be deeply ingrained in the human psyche. It's an instinct perhaps born of the fact that we all seem to think that our own beliefs are the right ones. Why else would we have them? If I didn't think my beliefs were correct, I wouldn't hold them after all, and I'm just sure that you would be a better person if you held them too. It's that kind of attitude that is the animating force behind the censor. Proponents of censorship never ask the government to censor what they might be reading or watching, for they are bright enough and strong enough to know what's best for themselves and to take care of themselves. But they have a deep and abiding suspicion that the rest of us are not quite as bright and not quite as strong as they are, and therefore government should help us decide what we should be reading, even though they are quite capable of deciding for themselves what they should be reading. That's why we have the First Amendment. The First Amendment stands as a bulwark against that kind of attitude, and its basic theory was expressed more than 3 centuries ago by the English poet John Milton. "Let truth and falsehood grapple," Milton said. "In a free and open encounter, truth will inevitably prevail." Or, as we think of it in more modern terminology, the First Amendment exists to protect the marketplace of ideas. Let free people speak. Let free people listen. Let free people sort out the good from the bad, the worthless from the frivolous, without the heavy hand of government telling us what we should and should not read. In this marketplace theory, freedom of speech is not just a matter of protecting a person's right to say something. It is also a matter of protecting our right to hear something, our right to receive information on any subject we choose, science or art or history or medicine or political theory, baseball, the philosophy of Plato, the private lives of the current rock stars. This fundamental right to exchange information about the whole range of human activity is the central meaning of the First Amendment. This is not a universally held belief, you know. This belief in the importance of free speech and free thought and free inquiry. There are systems of government in this world that are based on a distrust of the people, based on the premise that the people must be kept in the dark so that those who have power can stay in power. That's why dictators despise the internet. That's why dictators do everything they can to limit access to the information that is available on the internet. But that's not our system. We are committed in our nation to the proposition that in a marketplace of ideas, all ideas are welcome and all ideas are entitled to be heard. Almost 60 years ago, when Nazi troops were marching across Europe and Stalinist purges were the order of the day in Russia, our Supreme Court said this: if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or any other matter of opinion. The court's words are as fresh and as relevant, as immediate today as they were when they were written in 1940. Government cannot prescribe what shall be orthodox. The court said that principle was a fixed star in our firmament, but the effort to pull that star out of its orbit never ends, and we are seeing that effort now in the context of the internet. For it is the self-appointed role of the censor to try to use the power of government to do exactly what the court said more than a half-century ago government could never do: to prescribe what is orthodox, to tell librarians what books they should put on their shelves, to tell booksellers what books they should put in their stores, to tell public school teachers what books are fit for the classroom, and to tell everyone with a computer what is suitable for them to access over the internet. And of course, what is fit, what is suitable, is always what conforms to the censor's own beliefs and values. They look around at the variety of political and religious and cultural expression that exists in our society, and instead of rejoicing that we have the freedom that makes that diversity possible, instead of rejoicing at the strength that that diversity brings to our nation, they profess to be afraid of it. Let's require government employees to speak only English and no other language, they say, no matter how many immigrants of other tongues may be living in your state. Let's prevent our schools from talking candidly and truthfully about sexual orientation. Let's enlist the aid of government to promote our prayers and our religious observances. And above all, let's make sure that our libraries and now our internet don't contain anything that we don't want to read, anything that doesn't conform to our tastes and our values. 3 years ago, these people had a victory. They persuaded Congress to pass the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which made it a crime to send any indecent communication over the internet to any person under the age of 18. Their victory was short-lived, I'm glad to say. The American Library Association, the Society of Professional Engineers, the ACLU, and a host of other organizations immediately filed lawsuits to block this new law, and the Supreme Court did so. It ruled that speech on the internet is entitled to full First Amendment protection, and its decision in that case has become the Magna Carta for freedom on the internet. Government cannot limit speech on the internet to what is suitable for a 10-year-old. Now, that doesn't mean that there can be no restrictions on what is transmitted over the internet. Of course there can be. And there was a trial here in Portland last winter, that I'm sure you remember, that is a good illustration of that point. Threats of bodily harm are not protected by the First Amendment. They aren't now, they never have been, whether they are made by mail or by telephone or over the back fence. 2 or 3 years ago, a group of anti-abortion activists created a website that had some pretty inflammatory rhetoric on it about Planned Parenthood and about doctors who provide abortion services. And this website listed the names of abortion doctors who had been murdered. And on that list, it had drawn lines through the names of the doctors who had been killed. And then it gave the names and addresses of other doctors who were still living and still providing abortion services. And it gave the names of their spouses and their children and where they went to school and a lot of other personal information. Some of those doctors sued the proprietors of that website for threatening them with death or bodily harm. Were the statements on that website protected political commentary, or were they genuine threats? Was it reasonable for the doctors to interpret those statements as an expression of intent to cause harm to them? Did the operators of the website intend to cause the doctors to fear for their personal safety? Well, the court answered these questions not by applying any new law special to the internet. It applied traditional legal principles that were developed long before anyone had ever heard of the internet. And it concluded that the statements on the website were in fact genuine threats, and it issued an injunction against them. And I think the important point about that case is that it demonstrates that there are enough laws already in place to deal with speech that has no First Amendment protection on the internet. You can't use the US Postal Service or Federal Express to send child pornography or fraudulent sales pitches or threats of violence across state lines, and you can't use the internet to do so either. Courts already have the tools to deal with these problems when they occur. Now, proponents of censorship nevertheless argue that prosecuting a crime after the fact or suing somebody for damages after a threat has been made doesn't solve the problem of access to the material in the first place. Children or unwilling adults may be subject to offensive material that they shouldn't see or don't want to see, the argument goes, and therefore government should step in and restrict the availability of internet material before it makes its way to the computer in your home or in your office. Well, the first response to that argument is the most obvious one. Internet material does not make its own way to your computer screen. You have to invite it there. When you turn on a radio or television, you have no control over what comes through the speaker or what appears on your TV screen. But when you turn on your computer, internet communications don't automatically appear there. You have to take a series of steps that are considerably more deliberate than merely turning a dial to have anything at all appear on your screen. And if you are concerned that you may inadvertently go to a website that offends you, or if you are concerned that children or someone else may use your computer to go to that kind of website, you have a remedy. Software programs like Cyber Patrol and Web Nanny do an excellent job of filtering the internet. You can go to their websites and look at the criteria that they use for blocking websites. And if you agree with their standards, you can install their software on your computer. But there's something else you can do as well. You can now choose an internet service provider that shares your values as to what should be accessible and will do the filtering for you. You can't get on to the internet, after all, without an ISP, an internet service provider. And you can choose one that shares your values. In our own area, integrityonline.com is an ISP whose search engines constantly seek out any new websites that fall in certain categories. Categories having to do with sexual activity or with discrimination or with criminal activity. It'll block your teenager from downloading a term paper that he or she can turn in as their own. It prevents your computer from getting access to all those kinds of websites. And it seems to me that the availability of that kind of ISP and the availability of that kind of software that you can put on your own computer is a complete answer and is a sufficient answer to those who call for government to step in and decide what we should be able to see and read on our computers. It's your computer. It's entirely up to you to decide what websites you're going to visit. And if you want to make sure that no one can use your computer to access certain material, then you can decide to install the software that will block those sites, and you can sign up for an ISP that will block them for you. You decide what appears on your computer, not the government. Ah, say the censors, but what about public libraries? The decision to use filtering software or a restrictive ISP on your own computer doesn't answer the question of what to do about computers in public libraries. And these have become favorite targets of the censoring crowd. There's nothing new about that. Attacks on public libraries by those who fear the free trade in ideas are an old, familiar story, and so shall it ever be, I'm sure. But public libraries have responded quite appropriately to the criticism that they have not done enough to censor the internet. In the first place, it's not the business of public libraries to censor anything. The very reason for the existence of a public library is to promote the free trade in ideas, and decisions about restricting that freedom should not be lightly made. But having said that, I would agree that a public library does not violate the First Amendment if it makes available computers with different degrees of access to the internet. And that's exactly the kind of policy that the Multnomah County Library is now considering. Under the proposal that is currently under study, the library would install software that would make it possible for every user to specify at the beginning of a search session whether the user wants unrestricted access to the internet or whether they would prefer a filtered search that would block websites based on their content, sex-related sites, of course, or sites that deal with hate speech or violence or shopping or any other criteria that may be available. But the library will leave that choice to the user, including any user who happens to be a child. And in my view, that's how it should be. It's not the business of government to decide whether and what we should read, and that principle applies as much to children as it does to adults. There may be times when a child will use the library to access materials that her parent would prefer that she not have access to. But that was true long before the internet came along. A youngster was able to go to the library and read Lady Chatterley's Lover back in the 1950s, I happen to know. And if parents trust their children enough to let them go to the library without parental supervision, it's not the government's role to step in and say to that child, you shall not read that book, or you shall not visit that website. The bottom line is that it is appropriate for public libraries to make different internet access choices available, as long as the choice as to the degree of internet access is left up to the user. Well, government censorship. Government censorship is only one of the many First Amendment issues that have emerged in the law of the internet. You're going to find this hard to believe, I know, but lawyers have found the internet to be a fertile source of lawsuits of all kinds. A lot of the cases involve copyright and trademark issues. Who owns a person's name, for example? If you tell your computer to go to a website with the address gwbush.com, you will find a site that is, in the words of its designer, intended to poke fun at the Texas governor by comparing what he calls his youthful indiscretions with his tough-on-crime policies as an adult. It's political satire, in other words. But like all satire, it attempts to make a serious point, in this case, about drug use and about society's attitudes towards drug use. And in the give and take of our nation's political dialogue, that kind of unauthorized use of a political candidate's name is something that they all learn to live with. But what about those far-sighted computer users, especially a few years ago when the internet was still in its infancy, who foresaw the time when domain names, those addresses that we all use, might have great value to someone with a particular name? Nike.com, GeneralMotors.com, or whatever, and who took the initiative years ago to register their names, those kinds of names, for their own use. And then they demand a king's ransom when the company that actually uses that name tries to buy it back for use at its own website. Cyber squatting is the name that's been given to that practice, and it's become a serious economic issue for some companies. Or how about anonymity on the internet? Should users be required to identify themselves when they sign on and send a message out? Many private organizations insist on full disclosure. Harvard students, for example, can't use a university computer unless they sign on under a true and accurate, personally identifiable name. But most ISPs that you and I use, most ISPs that are available to the public at large, like AOL, they don't have such requirements. And you don't often see a person's real name on an email sent from a home computer. I know a woman who is Madame Defarge on the internet because she likes to knit. And that's a bit of personally identifiable information that is known to her family and friends, but not to the world at large. And on top of that, you've got to know a little bit about Dickens to understand the connection at all. A couple of years ago, the Georgia legislature prohibited the transmission of any message over the internet that did not reveal the true identity of the sender. And the federal court took just a few weeks to throw that law out. It cited a Supreme Court case of 5 or 6 years ago that had held that the decision in the political context, it was in the context of a political campaign and pamphlets being distributed in Ohio during a political campaign. The Supreme Court had ruled in that case that the decision to remain anonymous is an aspect of free speech that's protected by the First Amendment. After all, the court said the authors of the Federalist Papers signed those essays with the name Publius. And if it was all right for Alexander Hamilton to disguise his identity when he put pen to paper, it apparently has to be all right for you and me to disguise our identities when we put finger to keyboard. Well, these are a few of the First Amendment issues that have arisen in the context of the internet. There are many others. I haven't even touched on the questions of privacy that are so vexing people these days as internet website operators accumulate more and more and more data about us. The controversy a couple months ago when Amazon.com was releasing lists of but how many users at Nike were buying a certain book, or how many users of the Stanford University computers were buying a certain book. They backtracked from that to a certain extent, and those issues are troublesome ones. But I think that for the most part, existing laws and existing legal theories will be adequate to address those kinds of issues, and we don't need special laws to regulate the internet. In my view, the most important First Amendment issue regarding the internet is, and always will be, this question of government control of the content of internet communications. And I want to close this afternoon with some final thoughts on that point. The internet is without doubt the greatest technological phenomenon of our time. We can't even begin to dimly perceive the impact that it's going to have on our lives in the years ahead. But one thing we know, and we know it because thousands of years of human history have taught it to us, that freedom of thought and freedom of speech are the indispensable conditions for every other form of freedom. We can't be reminded of that fact too often, and it is our dedication to that principle that distinguishes our nation from every other nation that has ever been on the face of this planet. Free people who believe in free speech fight to preserve it, not because we believe that our view of the world is the only correct one. On the contrary, we do so because we insist that all points of view deserve to be heard. As I said earlier, not only for the sake of the speaker's right to speak, but also for the sake of the listener's right to hear. Free people who believe in free speech take to heart the words that Oliver Cromwell once wrote to the Presbyterian elders in Scotland, words that one of our greatest judges, learned Hand, said should be inscribed over the doorway of every school and every library and every church and every courthouse in the land. I beseech you, my friends, consider it possible that you may be mistaken. Free people who believe in free speech have a sense of their own limitations. They know that our journey for truth is a process, not an accomplishment. It is a journey, not an arrival. You just never know when you might learn something from the most unexpected source. You just never know when you might change your mind about some received truth that until a moment ago you thought was immutable. You just never know when you might realize that you were mistaken. In Shakespeare's play, Henry V encourages his troops at Agincourt, "Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more." Well, we know, unfortunately, that the battle against censorship won't be just once more, or twice more, or 100 times more. It's a battle that we are called to join every day, month after month, year after year, striving to keep the marketplace of ideas a reality, striving to keep our public libraries and our public schools and our bookstores and our theaters, and now, above all perhaps, our internet, free from the heavy hand of the censor, striving to make sure that government is never allowed to prescribe what shall be orthodox on the internet or anywhere else. I'm glad the City Club is part of that battle. Thank you very much.
Well, Charlie, thank you very much for a most informative presentation, as usual, for your City Club presentations here. My question deals with the difficult position we've placed librarians in, and that is that, like, for instance, within the Vancouver, Washington library system, a parent can block access for their children to certain areas on the net, or not block it. So my question to you is, in doing so, are parents and librarians participating in an unconstitutional act?
The Fort Vancouver Library has in place, I believe, the kind of system that the Multnomah County Library is now considering, this computers with varying degrees of filtering equipment on them, and it's up to the user to choose which degree of access they want to have when they sit down at the computer. The choice is there to have complete, unfiltered, unrestricted access. The choice is there to use one of the filtering search engines that will filter out certain sites. The question has to do more, I think, with the conflict between parental rights and children's rights. There are many areas in our social life in this country where parental rights and children's rights do conflict. Some of you may recall the U.S. Supreme Court case of 25 years ago involving the Amish in Wisconsin, Wisconsin had a law like every state, I suppose. It says you must send your children to public school until they're 16. Not public school, any school. They must be in school till they're 16. The Amish parents went to court and said, we don't want to send our kids to school till they're 16 because of the corrupting influences that schools have on teenagers. We want them to leave school when they are 13, when they graduate from the 8th grade or whatever. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the parents' rights to take the children out of school at age 13. And Justice Douglas dissented in part, and he said in so many words, did anybody ask the kids? Did anybody ask that 13-year-old Amish child if she wanted to leave school? Maybe she wanted to go on to be a neurosurgeon, but her parents took her out of school. Now, when parents send their children to libraries, it seems to me, as I said in my remarks, if they trust their kids to go to the library on their own, I think it's up to the child then, once in the library, to make that choice. I don't think it's the librarian's job to sit down with that child and say, your parent only wants you to read the Bobbsey Twins, you can't check out Tolstoy. And I don't think it's the librarian's job to tell the child that you have to use this filtering equipment. If the parent comes to the library with the child, the librarian is not going to interfere either, and the parent is presumably in charge. But if a child is there on his or her own, I don't think the librarian has any business in telling the child what restrictions they want to put on it. Now, I'm not sure is that you have something more in mind than that,
What
Kurt?
I was really thinking about was, does it represent
a breach of the child's constitutional rights? Or more specifically, First Amendment rights of the child. Well, I guess that really is what I'm trying to point out in that Amish parent's child. Do children have First Amendment rights at all? Do they have constitutional rights? The courts have said yes, to some limited degree. Think of the abortion context again. The U.S. Supreme Court has said that a minor girl must have the right to go to court to get judicial approval for an abortion if she's in a position where she cannot, for whatever reason, discuss the situation with her parent. That parents cannot have an absolute veto right over a minor daughter's right to have an abortion. Children do have that constitutional right at some age. At what age? Well, that's what judges are there to decide, because these are gray areas. They have to draw the line. Does a 16-year-old, in Oregon, 16-year-olds have the right to be emancipated, to make their own decisions about marriage. Obviously, if they're married, then they have the right to make their own decisions about family choices, and obviously what magazines they're going to subscribe to and what they're going to read when they go to the library. The U.S. Supreme Court has said children have the right, have constitutional rights. They can be restricted in certain circumstances. They are not full-blown 100% constitutional rights that adults have, but where constitutional rights come in conflict, the child's rights, it seems to me, have to prevail at a certain level. But your judgment about what that level is the same as mine. There was a conference at the Marriott over the weekend about children's rights in the medical treatment field. If your parents are Jehovah's Witnesses and you, a 14-year-old girl, are in an auto accident, you want a blood transfusion, thank you very much, because you want to live. Your parents are Jehovah's Witnesses and they do not want you to have the blood transfusion, who wins? The 14-year-old who says, please save my life, or the parents of the 14-year-old who say, no, we do not want that child to receive a blood transfusion? Christian Science parents sometimes run into the same kind of conflict. Hospitals in those cases have to decide. Courts have to decide. And courts have said over and over again, the child has a right to live. Now that's a pretty fundamental constitutional right. The courts have said that children have the right to have that blood transfusion even if their parents don't want them to. So you see, in many areas of life, there are conflicts between children's rights and parental rights, and in my view, at some point, the child's rights have to prevail. It's their life that is at stake, not the parents.
John Leeper, City Club member. Charlie, I enjoyed your presentation very much.
Thank you.
I'm standing behind a speaker that says against, but I'm certainly not against your speech. You very briefly spoke of privacy.
Right.
And to me, that poses one of the biggest quandaries in my own personal mind as to how can the internet address privacy and at the same time protect those people that want to use the internet for such things as financial records, health records, and it can go on from there. And I'd just like any additional comments you would care to offer on the privacy issue.
Well, there are a number of concerns there. One, I guess I am not quite so concerned about privacy issues as many people are. For this reason, for example, that Amazon.com issue that I raised earlier, Amazon was not saying, what is John Smith buying? You couldn't get on your computer and ask what my neighbor Mary is buying from Amazon.com, but you can go to Amazon.com and find out what the employees of PGE are buying, or everyone who has the Stanford computer, or anybody in a particular geographical area. You can find that out. That doesn't trouble me, and I will say further that it doesn't trouble me that Amazon.com knows that I bought a book from them. Because if I go to a bookstore downtown, Barnes & Noble or Scribner's, they know that I bought a book from them too. And what's more, if I go into the adult bookstore near my home, anybody who's driving by there can see that I'm going into it. And they can see my license plate on my car in front. That's why I park behind it when I go there. But when you make purchases in this life, when you go to church, when you go to synagogue, when you go to the city club, when you come into the Hilton Hotel, you are moving in a public place, and people can see you and do that. Ah, I know that she went to the city club last week, and if I'm interested enough, I can keep a record of that. And pretty soon I can sort of build up a profile that I know that Joella Werlin does this, that, and the other thing, because I saw her at the opera, and I saw her at this movie, and I saw her at that restaurant, and I saw her at this adult bookstore, and so on. So we can find out things about one another just by our naked eye. The internet is the same thing. I mean, after all, no one forces you, as I said earlier, no one forces you to go to Amazon.com. No one forces you to go to the adult sites that are on the internet. If they have a record that you've been there, yes, you went there. They're not saying anything false about you. Now, the other part of your question, though, John, is what about disclosure of that information to other people? Banks, yes, if you're going to do online financial, make online financial transactions, yes, your information should be secure. Every website now, or at least most websites, have their privacy policies on the website. You go to ebay.com, for example. This is one of the first big auction house. And they've got a terrifically detailed statement of their privacy policies. And you can read all the way through that, and you'll know exactly what information they're going to keep about you and what use they are going to make of it. And if you don't like that privacy policy, turn the computer off. Go somewhere else and buy your book or buy your gemstone or whatever it is. Banks are required to keep your financial data secret, whether or not it's on the internet, whether or not they obtain it through the internet, or by you walking into a branch somewhere. So I'm not troubled by that either. As I say, I think the general laws that already exist in our society are going to be 99.9% effective in dealing with these issues on the internet. Yes?
Does the government have access or collect data about internet users? And if so, what restrictions could be placed on this access?
Well, absolutely not. The government should not have access to that information. In fact, you may have read the case a few months ago where I think it was AOL disclosed the identity of a member of the armed forces who had visited one of its gay-oriented sites, or its chat rooms. AOL disclosed that to the military, and the serviceman was dismissed from the military for violation of the don't ask, don't tell policy. That was an outrageous breach of confidence on the part of AOL, and they immediately backtracked and apologized. And they said they won't do it again. To release that kind of information to the government is an outrageous invasion of privacy. But that was not the point of the question, the preceding question. The preceding question was, if I voluntarily give my information to X, can X use it? And the courts have said yes. If you voluntarily give your information to me today, I can use that for whatever purpose I want. If I think that you are a business person who has a certain kind of company that I'd like to represent, and I find that out because I've heard you talk at a city club meeting, there's nothing to prevent me from sending you a letter saying, I'm Charlie Hinkle, I'd like to be your lawyer. Send me your business. Well, if I'm running a website that sells garbage bags, and you come to my website and buy garbage bags from me, I can use that information to also try to sell you a trash compactor or something else. There's nothing wrong with that. That happens right now in our society. Safeway, has those club cards. They keep track of what you buy. When I checked out at Fred Meyer the other night, I had bought some cat food, and I got a coupon good for cat food. I didn't get a coupon good for dog food. I got a coupon good for cat food because they figured that I was going to be interested the next time I come back to Fred Meyer in buying cat food. So, merchants do this all the time, with or without the internet. I don't think the internet adds anything at all to that. Yes, sir.
Lynn Fraser, club member. As a librarian, like all of my other colleagues, I've fought all the battles against censorship. And that was no big deal. We were always successful for the most part. But isn't there a corollary? How do we prepare our citizenry, namely our children, to have those skills of critical thinking so when they face the diverse kinds of information, they can handle it? Case in point, do we not have a responsibility to fight the commercialization of our schools? Do we not have a responsibility to see that Coca-Cola and other companies don't write million-dollar contracts to bail out school systems and therefore brainwashing the kids to think that corporate messages are okay in schools?
Well, let free people decide. The commercialization of our public schools, I suppose, is a direct consequence of things like Measure 5, isn't it? It's the direct consequence of choices that you have made as the voters of Oregon, that you don't want to fund schools in a certain way, and yet you demand from school districts that they provide an education. I suppose if I were a school principal, I'd sell my coat to Coca-Cola. If I wore a Coke sign and they promised me a science lab, I'd be willing to wear a Coke sign that year if I cared about the kids in my school. You want to debate that? Oh, that's not the question. Okay.
All right, it's my fault that I didn't.
I like that question, but
I put it in simply. You're here advocating this position, which I believe almost all of us believe. At least I do very much. Should we not be advocating also with equal fervor to have schools that prepare our children intellectually to face this?
Oh, well, absolutely.
In other words, we should take a proactive step, not just say it's up to each individual citizen to vote one way or the other, but to take, as you are taking today, a proactive step to further this.
Absolutely. No, if the question is how do you prepare a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 40-year-old to decide what is good and what is bad, what is useful on the internet and what is not, what should be accessed on the internet and what should not be, how do you train people to have critical judgment? The answer is the way we hopefully have been doing it for thousands of years, through good parents and through good synagogues and through good churches and through good schools. We need those institutions and we need to support them.
Okay, I didn't do it for 2 times. This is my 3rd try. That's fine. We'll teach critical thinking in the schools. What's the good of teaching critical thinking in the schools when our schools sell out to Coca-Cola?
Well, does that go back to my selling out to the corporate? They're not selling. I make a contract with Coca-La that they will provide all the Coke in the soft drink machines at Grant High School. That's selling out to Coke.
But the educational materials, our textbooks are full with brand names that are sold through the textbook companies. I'm talking of the total commercialization of our schools that's going on today.
Well, I have the same answer that I said. I think my answer to that is what I said a moment ago. What in the world do you expect schools to do when we cut them off at the kneecaps? When we don't give the taxpayer support to schools to educate our children to the degree that we want them to be educated, I mean, it's no accident that Stanford University has a building named the Hewlett-Packard building. I mean, or College of Idaho is now Albertsons College, for heaven's sake. Why not? I mean, if Albertsons is going to pay enough money to keep that college open, what's the choice? Is it better to let the College of Idaho shut, or is it better to put Joe Albertson's name on the front door? I don't know who Mr. Dartmouth was, but I do know who Mr. Yale was, and they put his name on the door for exactly that same reason. He gave his library to Yale 300 years ago. That was the commercialization then. I bet that someone in the church stood up and said, we're commercializing our school because we're putting Elihu Yale's name on the door. Got to stop that. Well, I don't agree. Yes, sir.
I'm Bill Holmer, City Club member, and I'd like to thank you for your comments. I thought they were very insightful and helpful in thinking through this difficult question. One of the premises of your comments seemed to be that public librarians should not be in the business of censorship.
Yes.
Yet it seems to me that every time a public librarian makes a decision to buy one book and not another, or to subscribe to Time magazine and not to Hustler, they're exercising a form of censorship.
Sure.
And so my question would be, in your opinion, would a public librarian have the right to subscribe to a filtered internet service provider if that's what the librarian and the board of the library supported?
would they have the First Amendment right to do that? I suppose I would say yes, and my remedy for that would be to say, let's get a new librarian. Because yes, librarians make choices all the time. Librarians can't buy every book or subscribe to every magazine that's out there on the market. Librarians are in the business of making selections on behalf of all of us, and they are presumably choosing the widest variety of material that's available to serve the widest variety of tastes and needs in a public library. And if a librarian suddenly decided that he or she was not going to stock any books on math in the library because she wanted to emphasize biology, or she was only going to purchase books about Picasso because she didn't like Cézanne, sooner or later, that's sort of a self-correcting problem, isn't it? You get rid of that librarian. Librarians have to make choices. If they chose to bring in an encyclopedia that only went from A to Q, I think that you would hire another librarian next year. And if they chose to bring in internet access that only went from A to Q, you'd bring in another librarian next year. Might not violate anybody's First Amendment rights, but you would certainly conclude that you had made a mistake in your choice of librarians. Their selection criteria are inadequate. But that's not a First Amendment issue. That's, over the years, sometimes parents have sued public schools saying, we don't want our children to read The Merchant of Venice because it has anti-Semitic overtones. We don't want our children to read Huckleberry Finn because it contains the word nigger. Well, there is no First Amendment right to require public schools to teach Macbeth as opposed to Hamlet, as opposed to As You Like It, as opposed to The Merchant of Venice. You have to trust public school teachers and public librarians to make those choices for you. If you find over a period of time that they are intentionally suppressing a point of view, then the remedy is to get rid of them. Andrew.
I think you said, Andrew Wheeler, I think you said before that government shouldn't describe what is orthodox on the internet or anywhere else. And I'm wondering if you can bring that into the realm of choice, and choice for governments like the Oregon versus the federal government in terms of freedom of choice or choice of individuals. Choice issues, orthodoxy.
Choices about what, Andrew? Are you thinking of assisted suicide by any chance?
Yes.
Well, that's a vexing problem, isn't it? That we hear voices in the land for years saying, let's let states decide, let's give more power to the states, let's cut down on the power of the federal government, let's uphold principles of federalism. We don't want the nation run from Washington, except, of course, when it comes to my values that I want to impose on the rest of the nation. I think Congress's action on assisted suicide may be the greatest single act of hypocrisy that we've seen in a generation. Regardless of what you feel about the merits of assisted suicide. The states, Justice Brandeis said a half-century ago, states are supposed to be the laboratories for experimentation. They are not supposed to march to the drummer in Washington, D.C. The people who are in Washington, D.C. right now ought to listen to that message. I mean, if the people of Oregon have said anything emphatically, it's pretty rare to get 60% vote in favor of anything on a ballot in any American state. And when the effort to repeal the assisted suicide law was rejected by a 60% margin, by a lot of people who actually have, are by no means in favor of assisted suicide, but they said, we voted, the people have spoken, we'll say it again, can't you hear us? And if the states' rights advocates in Washington, D.C. turn their backs on that expression of opinion, as I said, I can't imagine any of you coming up with a greater example of hypocrisy. Yes.
Laura Nigro, City Club member. This question keys off the one before last. Referring back to your reference with Lady Chatterley, which I regard as a great work of literature, I think a more apt analogy might be that the libraries in the 50s and now do not stock Hustler, which I think would be more equivalent to some of the content sites on the web. If we are in an age where we are beginning to allow exposure, free public exposure to a broad number of young people emerging to later on take positions of citizenship and leadership in society, to this sort of content and messages of debasement, is it possible that we are approaching a juncture now where there is an issue even more primary to the First Amendment that supersedes that we as a society, as a civilization, need to reckon with? Just a philosophical question.
I think your analogy to Hustler is a good one. And I guess I would respond in this way. 50 years ago, if my parents wanted me to have access to Hustler, they could do that. They could go buy Hustler and they could put it by my bed and I could read it. If parents now want me to have access to equivalent kind of material on the internet, they can allow me to do that in their homes. It seems to me that really goes to the heart of the question that was asked earlier about how do you inculcate values? How do you instill critical thinking? How do you instill the ability to make choices, intelligent, responsible choices in our young people? But if a parent is going to make irresponsible choices and is going to provide cigarettes to their 10-year-olds and is going to provide Hustler magazine to their 10-year-olds, whether it's in the form of a written word or on the internet, I think that that's something that parents have to deal with.
Actually referring to the library.
Well, I understand that, but parents send their children to libraries. Parents can go with them. Parents can say to their children, I don't want you to go to this kind of site. I don't want you to read this sort of thing. And if they don't trust those children not to go to the 7-Eleven and buy a Hustler magazine, or to go to the library and not access a site that they don't want them to see, then the parents have a problem with those children, but they should go with them. If parents think that children are abusing a particular privilege, whether it's access to alcohol or tobacco or to pornography, parents ought to be giving more supervision to those children, spending more time with them, whether it's in their home or in the public library. Children are not autonomous agents. A 10-year-old can be guided by a parent and should be guided by a parent. I'm just saying the government should not make that decision. If I want to give my 10-year-old a cigarette, the government should not make it a crime for me to do that. And if I want to show my son, who's 10 years old, a Hustler magazine or the Bible or the Iliad or the Koran or the Communist Manifesto, that is my prerogative. I may be a lousy parent, but I don't want the Platonic guardian or the animal farm pig to come in and tell me that they can do a better job, thank you, of raising my children.
I'm sorry we don't have time for any more questions. Thanks very much, Charlie. Wonderful job. We're adjourned.